Hey, it's Sila Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sila Social Studies. These next two videos are going to probably be a little bit longer just because of the way I broke down the Roaring Twenties. I broke it down to only 2 parts instead of 4, and ultimately one day when I have all the free time in the world, which is never, I'll fix it. So until now, just bear with me please. These are going to be 2 little bit longer videos. So, Roaring Twenties. After the Great War had ended in 1918, a presidential election loomed in the near future in 1920, and President Wilson suffered a stroke and hoped to run for a third term as president, but instead, the Democratic Party put forth James Cox from Ohio, and his running mate was future President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Republican Party chose Warren G. Harding from Ohio, and Harding chose Calvin Coolidge as his running mate. And the uncertainty of what post-war America was going to look like, Harding ran on a campaign that promised to return the country to stability and prosperity, and Harding called his promise a return to normalcy. So Warren Harding won the 1920 presidential election in a landslide, winning over 60% of the popular vote, and the Republican decided it was time to get the government out of business again. Harding decided that he would first implement a series of tax cuts for the wealthy, and during the war, remember, the wealthy were being taxed nearly 67%, and immediately after, those taxes remained, so he was going to get rid of those high taxes. The U.S. was suffering from some economic downfall and a recession when Harding called on his Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon to figure out a way to improve the economy. And Mellon produced the largest tax cuts in history to the wealthy, which would introduce an economic theory that tax cuts to the wealthy would in turn help the lower class, resembling an economic theory called trickle-down economics, where the wealth trickles down to the lower man. And in August 1923, President Harding suffered a fatal heart attack, thrusting his Vice President Calvin Coolidge into the office of the presidency, and Coolidge would finish serving Harding's term and be re-elected in 1924. So the 1920s were a period of huge economic growth, and it was all done for the vast majority under these two men, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. So what type of policies do they put into effect? Well, President Harding and Coolidge put Republican-based policies in place to immediately strengthen the economy and fix the government and businesses in the United States. The progressives at the turn of the century attacked businesses with big government and limited the amount of economic growth. So to rescue the economy, Harding and Coolidge supported a return to laissez-faire type of government and its involvement in business. And if you remember when we covered the Gilded Age, laissez-faire is when the government is hands-off of business as a whole. And during the Gilded Age, it led to a few men becoming super wealthy, and it will again lead to that prosperity. The other policy that Republicans supported was this idea of isolation. Remember, we covered U.S. imperialism and America's annexation of countries like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So imperialism is the policy of extending the country's power and influence through diplomacy or a military force. And it was one of the 4 main MAIN causes of World War I. So Harding felt that it was time for America and their dealings in foreign governments to come to a stop. So President Harding's foreign policy ideas dealt with disarming nations and even agreeing not to go to war with any of these countries. Imperialism in the United States is now dead in what Harding calls the country's return to normalcy. So for the short time that President Harding was in office, his administration was not void of scandal. There were many instances of corrupt politics in government. It was also well known that the people that Harding recommended for high government positions were corrupt. And one such controversy was called the Teapot Dome scandal. So the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was accepting quote-unquote gifts from oil companies that he allowed to drill for oil and control the federal oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, which was an area that was set aside for the use by the U.S. Navy. This is a big no-no. Private companies should never be allotted such rights. The investigation found Fall guilty of bribery and conspiracy when the attorney uncovered that Fall was paid one of these quote-unquote gifts of $385,000 and a large herd of cattle. Fall was jailed for just 1 year as a result, leading to Fall being the first former cabinet officer sentenced to prison as a result of misconduct in office. So what about European nations returning to normalcy? So after the death and destruction of World War I, European nations were terrified that another war like that could happen again. So world leaders felt that if we did have another war like World War I, the world would pretty much be destroyed. Remember, the war to end all wars. Countries tried many different ways to try and avoid another catastrophe like the Great War and came to a conclusion. From November 1921 till February 1922, 9 countries met in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Naval Arms Conference. It was the first arms conference meeting and the first arms control meeting in history, and attempted a limited disarmament between powerful world nations like Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. And disarmament was basically the reduction of the armies and specifically the navies of these countries, putting a limit on the number of battleships each one of these countries can control. So over time, some European countries felt like the Washington Naval Arms Conference was not going to be enough to keep the peace in the world, especially when so many nations relied on the United States to rebuild their economies, and they were still suffering from the war. And with the war still fresh in everybody's mind, these countries again came together to make a plan to avert another devastating war. And in 1928, world leaders met in France to sign the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Okay, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact was basically a gentleman's agreement that promised not to use war to resolve these disputes or conflicts or whatever nature of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them. Basically, it meant that it would outlaw war, but did not lay out any real plan to enforce the pact. So originally it was signed by the United States, France, and Germany, with 11 nations following quickly. And by the time the pact was ratified, there were 62 nations that signed onto the pledge. And today there are more than 180 nations signed on to this Kellogg-Briand Pact. And many felt it was totally unenforceable, while others believed it was a sign that most countries really truly wanted to prevent another global conflict. A last goal of the European return to normalcy was figuring out a way that Germany wouldn't be so absolutely destroyed economically due to the ramifications of the Treaty of Versailles. In steps Charles Dawes. And in 1924, Germany's economy was in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles required that the country pay back billions in reparations, and they just couldn't afford it. The underlying issue at hand was that if Germany couldn't repay their reparations to the Allied nations, then they could not pay off their loan debt to the United States. So Charles Dawes hatches this genius arrangement for Germany to help them pay back their reparations while helping the United States. And I'm going to go ahead and put this out plan by plan, step by step on this next slide here. So number one, Germany was poor and could not keep up with their reparation payments. Makes sense. And since Germany couldn't pay,
France entered the Ruhr land in Germany in order to force this reparation payment.
The U.S. steps in and would give Germany $200 million, help them set up a bank to kickstart their economy, and the U.S. would also set up a payment plan that the Allied powers could agree on. Basically, if Germany could pay it, they would. And if Germany couldn't afford it, they could pay a little less. Number 4 is Germany would pay France some of their reparations, and France would leave the Ruhr. Problem solved. Then France would take that money and pay back the U.S. a part of their loan debt. Perfect. And finally, when Germany could pay, just like I said before, they would pay the U.S. back on their loan. So France gets the money, pays back the U.S., pays off their loan debt. When Germany could pay the U.S., because of so many of these long-term loans, they would pay the U.S. back part of their loan as well. So basically, it's a big circle of moving debt. With the German economy faltering, the U.S. stepped in and originally loaned them $200 million, set up the German National Bank and a payment plan. Basically, it was $1 million for the first 5 years and $2.5 million for every 5 years after that, and as long as Germany was able to pay it. U.S. banks would issue more than 100 long-term loans to Germany to assist their economy, and Germany would take these loans to build their economy and pay off the Allied powers the reparations that were owed by the Treaty of Versailles. This allowed the Allied powers, Britain and France, to repay their war debt back to the United States, and then Germany would pay back those loans to the United States as well. So the U.S. basically helped everybody pay off all their war debts with U.S. bank loans. So this Dawes plan was very successful with one caveat. It was 100% reliant on the American economy, and you will see we will have issues with that a little bit later. So what happened to immigrants in the United States during this time? Remember when we talked in class that the U.S. experienced 3 major rounds of immigration: the British, then the Irish and the Germans from 1840 and 1860, the Italians, the Greeks, Chinese, Russians between 1880 and 1914. And it's basically the start of World War I that, immigration into the United States kind of stops. And now that the war was over, what was America going to do about the immigration issue? So basically stop it, right? That's what. Like every major wave of immigration, Americans had concerns about the newly arrived, and xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, ran rampant across America, so Americans attempted to restrict it. Many of the new arrivals entered the country with no money. They couldn't speak any English, and like always, laborers felt that the new immigrants would take their jobs for less pay. They also feared that these new immigrants would infiltrate and change the American culture. So much so that the government needed to step in. And in 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, which limited the total number of immigrants allowed in the country, allowing the majority of immigrants from Western European nations only to come to America. And 3 years later, in 1924, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which banned immigration from East Asia entirely, just like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And it also reduced the number of immigrants allowed to enter the country to only 350,000 per year. So the combination of these two acts led to a drastic drop in immigration to the United States, and Americans were basically becoming fearful of these immigrants, and it began to show. How does it begin to show? Well, all these post-war tensions and xenophobia compiled into one famous court case in the 1920s, the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. And Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants and anarchists, or people who are anti-government or favoring no government at all. America's fear and distrust of immigrants led to the belief that all immigrants are dangerous, and on April 15, 1920, a payroll clerk and security guard were shot to death and robbed of $15,000. Eyewitness said that they saw 2 men commit the crime and get into a getaway vehicle with 2 or 3 other people. And after several weeks, only Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested. There were no other arrests, and money was never linked to them or even recovered. Now, when they were arrested, they were armed, but that's still very little evidence for conviction. So Sacco and Vanzetti swore that they were innocent until their last breath. The prosecution focused on their anarchist past and the fact that they were Italian immigrants, and that's all they needed to hear. In 1921, they were convicted, later to be executed in 1927. Riots and protests sprung up all over Italy, while some Americans celebrated Sacco and Vanzetti's death. So the view on immigrants was steadfast in America. They were dangerous. And what else was dangerous? Well, Russia. Near the beginning of World War I in 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian monarchy and took over the government, putting in place their favored form of government, communism. And after the war, Americans feared that communists would attempt to gain the power in the United States, and that led to another fear and scare of another group of immigrants and government ideas as a whole. The Communist Labor Party was formed by radicals in 1919 and was blamed for many of the 3,000 labor strikes after the war. In the spring of 1919, nearly 40 mail bombs were sent in the mail to many senators, attorney generals, and famous people like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Some of the bombs detonated and some of the bombs didn't, but all the bombs were blamed on anarchists and communists, even though that there was very little evidence to support the claim. The bombings across the United States led to another fear of Italian anarchists and Russian communists, otherwise known as Reds, and led to a period of time called the Red Scare. And in response to the bombings, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer organized a series of raids nationwide between the end of 1919 and the start of 1920 called Red Summer. The raids, called Palmer's Raids, broke up communist and radical groups across the nation using physical violence, arresting thousands and deporting hundreds back to Russia. So what type of people were fighting for rights in America? After the war, minority groups began to organize and demand civil rights. Remember that during the war, a majority of young white laborers were sent off to the war, leading to a large migration of Mexican and African Americans from the South to the North. And in 1929, Latin Americans formed the League of United Latin American Citizens, which would protest segregation and voting restrictions. Native Americans fought for their rights too, as well. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizens Act, which granted citizenship to all Native Americans and later prevented the federal government from taking back reservation lands. And one of the largest groups of people to move from the South to the North are African Americans. I mentioned that this was called the Great Migration, and it lasted decades. Huge numbers of African Americans left the South to take jobs in the northern factories during the war, and it lasted throughout the 1920s. In 1919, while many white laborers, fearing that African Americans would be lasting competition, race riots broke out in Chicago, which left 500 injured and 39 dead. Prior to the 1920s, the KKK was on a decline, and northern white labor riots and southern white aggression, the KKK made a resurgence in the South. The Klan harassed African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. They would physically abuse them, injure them, and even kill the people that they didn't like. The Klan worked against urbanization, women's rights, and modern technology. Membership ballooned to over 5 million members during the 1920s, consisting of many members who belonged to the local and state police forces and government officials. The Klan became very influential in Southern politics. And who would fight against this? Who would fight against this and fight for the rights? The fighting for the war against the Klan, African Americans began to fight and protect their own rights. One of the strongest proponents for African American rights was this man right here, Marcus Garvey. He was a leader among the black citizens across the United States. He formed the United Negro Improvement Association to promote economic cooperation among black businesses. He encouraged black people to express their pride in their culture and establish economic independence. Garvey would dress up like he is there in military garb, even though he wasn't in the armed forces. And after witnessing the wrongs against African Americans, he decided that equality could never be attained in America. As the NAACP placed advertisements in newspapers across the nation, Garvey created the Back to Africa movement. He made black people proud of their race, and this was the new black nationalism movement that took root in America. The Back to Africa movement was a plan to bring black Americans back to the motherland, and a strong revival of black culture would flourish. After he gained nearly 80,000 followers, Garvey founded the Black Star Steamship Company and began transporting African Americans back to Africa. Sadly, the government kept a close eye on the Crusader, and he was convicted of mail fraud and deported to Jamaica. Next, we're going to get into the economy of the Roaring Twenties.